Hey everyone, welcome to this video all about isolated VMs and dedicated hosts, something we may want to use if we just don't want to share. As always, this is useful. A like and subscribe is appreciated. Now, if we look at regular virtual machines in Azure, obviously they run on pieces of hardware. So I can think about there's a physical host, and these physical hosts are generally very, very large. And so when I create my virtual machine, so I go and create, this is my VM, I'm not the only VM on that piece of hardware. Other people, other companies, they go and create virtual machines. And so somewhere else on that same box is another tenant virtual machine. We don't get our own physical boxes. Now realize what's happening under the covers though is, for example, on the host, it's Hyper-V. And what Hyper-V does is, well, each of these virtual machines lives within this set of virtualized hardware. And the hypervisor makes sure, even if this VM is running on the same host, it has no way to go and look at the memory or look at the processor registry states of other virtual machines. It's completely isolated. There's no way this VM can try and look at something in another virtual machine. Likewise, the networking, well, the networking is all software-defined networking. It's all SDN. And so even again, I might be sharing physical network interfaces. There's no concept of me trying to run in a promiscuous mode and look at other things on the wire. It wouldn't work. I only get the traffic that the virtual filtering platform on the virtual switch targets to my virtual machine that's destined for me. So I'm completely safe from hey, I'm worried about this other VM looking at my stuff. But there may be other things I'm worried about. Well, what if they take my resources? Well, once again, realize every virtual machine in Azure has certain limits. And you can see them if you go and look at information about a VM. Certain number of virtual CPUs, certain amount of virtual memory, certain amount of IOPS, certain amount of throughput, certain amount of network bandwidth. So there are these limits in place that really stop a particular VM going really over a certain amount and interrupting and being a noisy neighbor, impacting what my virtual machine can do. So it's very secure, has a lot of controls in place. If I was really paranoid, there's things like confidential computing, where I can have secure enclaves of memory for particular apps, or even complete VM encryption. But maybe I still don't like the idea of this sharing. There might be certain factors at play. For example, there might be certain regulations, maybe by industry, by government, that says I can't share the physical hardware with other people. It might just be a trust issue. I have trust issues. I don't fully believe in the hypervisor, or the SDN's a bit dodgy because you're still using that. I don't want to share. I don't want to share hardware with other people. Maybe I am concerned about the noisy neighbor. Again, there's limits in place, but sometimes you'll see it's a maximum, not a provisioned amount. And technically, in rare cases, maybe I could impact the latency. I could take up a bunch of resource and it might increase the latency of the network maybe on someone on the same host. So maybe that's a concern. And also another factor may just be maintenance. Now I'm doing this last because I wouldn't use any of the things I'm going to talk about for maintenance control. There's a lot of things going on in the platform that give me more control of the maintenance activities. And even where I do have control, well, the things we're going to talk about may not always apply, like top of rack switch work. This wouldn't cover that anyway. But maybe I do want a bit more control. And so there are different options available for, well, what can I do to try and address some of these things? And generally the big focus is around this. I just want my own piece of hardware because of regulations, because I've got trust issues. I am concerned about that noisy neighbor scenario. So remember, we had that physical host. That physical host is really, really big. So one of the solutions we have available to us, my VM is blue. One solution is I just create a really, really big virtual machine. So I just create a VM that fills up the box. So I'm just creating my VM as usual, but there are particular SKUs that we think of as an isolated VM. Because it's so big, no one else can fit on that box. So we have a host, and all I'm doing is I'm creating a VM that's so big, I take up the whole box. So no one else can fit on it, so I get the box to myself. Beyond that, there's nothing special going on. There's no special configurations I'm doing. I can use all of the same features around, for example, availability sets, availability zones. I'm provisioning things the same way. All of those same constructs just apply. It's just I'm so big, I'm taking up the entire box. And there are a number of these offerings available. If we go and look for a second, we can see about this virtual machine isolation. And it tells you, well, what are these SKUs? So it goes through, hey, if I created one of these virtual machines, then it's so big, it's just going to take up the entire box. So I would not be sharing with anyone else. Now, I want you to also notice, though, there's a depreciation. So there are some VMs that used to be isolated, but they're not going to be isolated anymore. And if you think about it, that's actually very, very logical. Because hardware advances. There's constantly new generations of hardware in the Azure data centers. So a VM of a certain size that used to take up the entire host, as the physical hardware advances and has greater capacity, then that old VM no longer fills up the box. So I can still create that SKU, it's just not going to be isolated anymore. So bear in mind that over time, these things might shift, and I have to keep ahead of this. Now, again, I would not create an isolated VM just to be on my own piece of hardware, because these are big VMs. If my workload warranted it, then great, it makes sense. It's kind of just an easy win. But I definitely wouldn't want to use this as a solution. Hey, I'm just going to create a isolated VM to make sure I'm all on my own. That would be a very, very expensive solution to that. So what's another thing I can do? Well, the other option is I can think about, I want to buy out the capacity of a box. So my other option here, I'm going to do it in a slightly different color, is I could think about, okay, there's a certain host. I'm going to buy out that host. So I'm going to do a dedicated host. Now that host will be of a certain SKU. And this is important because obviously if you think about Azure virtual machines, there are some that are memory optimized. They have more memory ratio compared to the virtual CPU. There are some that are general, so it's a fairly equal. There are some that are compute optimized. There are different generations that have different Azure compute units as the underlying physical hardware advances. So the idea here is that I buy out the complete capacity of the entire box of a certain SKU, and then I can fill it with varying sizes that match that SKU. So maybe I'll create a big VM here. So these are all my VMs. No one else is allowed on this box. I might have empty capacity. That's fine, it's still just mine. Maybe I'll create a smaller VM. Maybe I'll create another biggish one over here. But it's my box. I fill it up with my thing. So the huge push here is I don't want to share because of that regulatory, because of that trust, because of those concerns over the noisy neighbor. Could be government. It could just be a games company. I'm really worried about that latency or someone might get kicked out the game. I want absolute control. It's only my workloads running on it. Hey, I can use dedicated host for that. One of the nice things also is because it's just my box, I can now do things like Windows and SQL hybrid benefit, where I can license the physical processors, the cores on the physical host, and I get unlimited virtualization of Windows and SQL. So there are some nice benefits to this. Now, the way we use dedicated host is there's really two constructs as part of it. I don't actually just create a dedicated host. The first thing that actually happens is I create a host group. So I think about this idea. I'm going to make this pretty big. The first thing I create is a host group. Now that host group, it lives within a specific region. So I create it in a region. I could leave it as a regional, or I can then say I want it in a specific availability zone. It cannot span availability zones. I can say I want a host group in AZ1. I want a host group in AZ2. I want a host group in AZ3, etc. So I can pick those things. I can tell it how many fault domains I want. So in between 1 and 5 fault domains, which will then surface up. If I think about this, then I'd see fault domain kind of 0, fault domain 1. I'll just say I picked 3, fault domain 2. So 0 to 4, 1 to 5. So I can pick how many racks do I want, because again, I may want resiliency within the zone of a rack level failure, a top rack switch, a power supply unit. So I get to pick how many fault domains do I want. Then there are things like, hey, do I want auto placement, which we'll talk more about? Do I want to be able to use ultra disk? So I get these various options as part of the host group. And we can see that super quickly. So if I jump over here, if I jump to the portal, I look at host groups. When I create a host group, notice my options are, I pick a name, sure. I pick a location, so I'll pick one with availability zones. And then I can pick a particular availability zone, or I could pick it as none. Oh, it's just regional. I don't know which data center this picks. I just have that available to me. Or I know I'm actually going to create multiple host groups. I'm going to create a host group in AZ1, a host group in AZ2, and a host group in AZ3. And then I'll create resources in those different host groups, so I'm split over multiple AZs in that region. And then, hey, I get things like I can pick the fault domain count. You can see here. Now, notice it's actually telling me for my subscription location, I can't have more than 3. It's actually limiting me to the 3 that I drew earlier. But some places you can actually go up to 5. Do I want automatic host assignment? And do I want to enable Ultra SSD capabilities? And that's it. That's the only things that I do as part of the host group. So that's creating that construct into which I'll then create my dedicated hosts. So then once I've created the host group, I then create my host. And my host, I pick the host group I'm going to create it in. I pick which fault domain within that host group I want to create it in. So I can basically pick the rack, and I pick the SKU. So obviously I could create multiple hosts in the same host group. So now, assuming I've already gone ahead and I created a host group, so you can see I've created it in WestUS 2, in AZ1. So now if I went to hosts, well, now I can create a new host. I have to do it in, I'll take the same resource group, and I do a name. Notice it already found my host group. I have to pick the size family. So this is the key point here. My host is of a certain SKU. So I pick the type of SKU for the host, and that will control the types of VMs I can create on that host. I can only create VMs that match the SKU of the host itself. So if I was to, for example, let's go and look at all the different VMs I could do. So this is looking at dedicated host SKUs. And if I look at the different types of SKUs that are available, you see all these, so let's say DCS v3, DCS v2, DCS v4. So that's the type of the host. And then notice I can fill it up with different sizes of the corresponding VM. So that's really the key point. So I can fill it up with lots and lots in this example of, for example, 2 virtual CPU virtual machines, or I could use 4. I can use a whole mixture. It doesn't have to be the same one. I could have 20 D2s and 3 D4s and whatever combination I want until I max out kind of the vCPUs or the memory of that particular box. So the key point here is that, hey, I pick the SKU of the host based on the specific types of virtual machines that I want to fill it up with. I can't mix. I couldn't put a completely different SKU on that host. So if I wanted different types of virtual machines, I'd create different hosts in the host group that support those different SKUs of VM. I can pick the fault domain based on the host group, what I configured on the host group. There's options, depending on my auto placement, about automatically replace the host. And do I already have Windows Server or SQL licenses? So that's creating the host. So I'm creating a host in the host group, and I get to pick which fault domain I actually want to put it into. So I could create multiple hosts of different SKUs in, hey, I want some maybe in the same fault domain, so they'd have very low latency. I'll use a slightly different purple on that one. There we go. Make it a bit more consistent. And then maybe, hey, I want good resiliency. So hey, I want another host in another rack, but in the same AZ, maybe another host as well. And again, if I then wanted to be able to have workloads in a different availability zone, not just a different rack, I'd create a different host group. This time, if this was the AZ1 host group, I'd create a host group in AZ2, then maybe another host group in AZ3, and add hosts into it. And then once I've done all of that, once I've gone and actually created my host group, create the hosts, I now deploy workloads to it. I can deploy virtual machines. I can deploy virtual machine scale sets. I can deploy AKS node pools, which sit on top of virtual machine scale sets fundamentally. So then when I have my workload, when I'm actually ready and I've got, hey, I've got my virtual machine over here, I deploy it. Now I can target a particular host. I want to deploy to this particular host I created. Or if I turned on auto placement, then what I can target is the host group. And then it will just deploy my VM or my VMSS to the most logical host based on capacity, matching the SKU, and all of those different things for me. So if I turn on auto placement, I can then target the host group. Even with auto placement, I can still target a particular host if I wanted to. It's up to me. But by turning on that auto placement, I get that benefit of being able to deploy at that level. A few little caveats. Today, Azure Site Recovery does not support a target using dedicated host. I can replicate off of a VM that's running on dedicated host, but not to another dedicated host. But I can still use things like UltraDisk. If I turn that option on, I still get accelerated networking. And the key point really about both dedicated hosts and isolated, they're still regular ARM virtual machines. I'm still using regular virtual networks. I can still use all the same monitoring constructs and agents and extensions. It's just, I'm not sharing. That's really the key point of both isolated VM and dedicated host. I'm not having to change the way I do things. I can still deploy with an ARM JSON. I can still deploy with a bicep file. I can still use the portal. I can use all of the constructs of virtual machines. I'm just not sharing the underlying host anymore with anyone else. Now, there are some considerations though, especially with dedicated host. One of the nice things about the cloud is this idea of, hey, I pay for what I'm using. Imagine I want to auto scale. So imagine I want to create and delete virtual machines based on, hey, what's the seasonality of my workload? Well, with dedicated host, remember, I'm creating and deleting within the hosts in my hosts group. So if I delete VMs, my cost doesn't change. I don't pay for the VMs, I pay for the capacity of the host. So if that host is full, or if that host was just running one VM, my bill is the same. I'm paying for the host. And so in that case, if I do have a big variation in the amount of work I need to do and the number of instances, this may not be cost effective because I'm just going to have boxes sitting there, maybe mostly idle. Technically, I can create and delete these whenever I want. I think it bills you at an hourly level, but I could absolutely at night delete boxes and then create them the next morning. I could have some automation to do that. And providing, hey, the capacity is there, it'll just let me create new dedicated hosts, add them into my host group, and then could start scaling the workloads into it. So there isn't a minimum time, but realize that I'm billed per hour, so it will round up to the nearest hour. But if I do have that heavy variation, and I don't have complementary workloads, what I mean by that is if I had multiple workloads where one of them is peaking, the other one's maybe low, and then maybe when the other one is now a quiet time, maybe the other one is a batch job that runs at night, well, hey, they'll kind of switch, but they'll still utilize the hardware well. In which case, that's not a big deal. But definitely think about that as a factor with dedicated host. Now, there is another benefit when I think about I'm just not sharing anymore. And that's maintenance. Now, again, I said this is not a primary driver for this, but it is something to be aware of. So one of the things we do get is I can absolutely now create a maintenance configuration. And then with the maintenance configuration, I can target isolated VMs and I can target dedicated hosts. That gives me this 35-day rolling window. I need at least a 2-hour maintenance slot within there. I can now control when maintenance happens. So if we jump back over here for a second, if I go and look at maintenance configurations, I can create maintenance configurations. Now there are different types of maintenance configuration. You'll notice there are maintenance configurations that apply to the host, and that's what we are focused on. So this is all about, notice it says isolated VMs and Azure dedicated hosts. And obviously isolated VMSS is just VMSS using isolated SKUs. But there are other types, like the OS image updates and guests for things like Azure VMs Arc and where they do their maintenance. But we're really focused on this host option. And then what I can do, I can add a schedule. So I add a starting when this schedule is going to apply. And then I specify a minimum a 2-hour window, could be more. And then I pick, well, how does this repeat? Day, week, monthly. And then assign it to this maintenance configuration. Then I would just add the machines to it. So I would add in my dedicated hosts. I would add in my isolated virtual machines. Post creation, I could go and add additional machines to this. But one of the things it is obviously giving me now is I get more control of the underlying maintenance that happens to those hosts. So maintenance still has to happen to the physical box, to the hypervisor. But with these models, I do get more control. But again, there are certain maintenance that won't fall into this. Hey, there's still things about top of rack switches, power supplies. So this doesn't give me control of every single aspect. And again, the fabric is doing a lot of advancements to even outside of these constructs to try and give us more control. So I would not be thinking about using these just for maintenance. The driver for these is I don't want to share because of regulation or trust, or I'm hypersensitive to even the tiniest bit of possible noisy neighbor. That's where these really come into play. But again, realize over time, physical hardware will advance, especially for the isolated VMs. What's isolated today may not be isolated tomorrow. So we need to keep an eye. Likewise, different SKUs for the dedicated hosts may come into play, and as I want different types of virtual machines. But that's it. I mean, that's really the solution when we think about, I just don't want to share. I need some additional level of isolation because of some regulation or something else. We have those constructs available without having to fundamentally change how we do things in Azure. There are other things out there in the Azure world, but dedicated host and isolated VMs doesn't change how I have to do things. It's just regular Azure VM constructs and VNets and extensions and everything else. It's very, for the most part, painless to use these things. So that was it. As always, I hope this was useful and made sense. Until next video, take care.